Hello lovelies, bit tired and strung out, but I finished the primary writing and some edits on Actual Fucking Monsters yesterday. After a weekend of drink and very late streaming and so on, I somehow decided it was a brilliant idea to stay up until 2 AM to finish that off. So I'm a bit tired, bit strung out, but still. This is a requested video asking about my D&D House Rules. Now, I did not grow up or come into the hobby playing D&D. I'm a bit of a freak, bit of a twist, bit of a sport, a little bit queer in that way. I came at it through fighting fantasy initially. Yeah, role-playing without knowing that we were role-playing. A friend of mine had an encyclopedic collection of fighting fantasy books, and we would play through them together, with one of us, usually me, reading the descriptions and the other one making the decisions, and so on. Role-playing without realising that we were role-playing, basically. And then not exactly advanced fighting fantasy, but fighting fantasy as an actual RPG came along, and then advanced fighting fantasy. But there were other things then, like Dragon Warriors, very, very British RPG, very sort of rooted in medieval folklore and so on. And the other kind of fantasy influence, I've always been more of a science fiction guy, but the other fantasy influences that were in my life were not Jack Vance or Michael Moorcock or Rob E. Howard. They were Tolkien, Lewis, until I realised it was Christian propaganda, 2000 AD, Slain. And at the time, you know, there were Games Workshop stores on practically every high street, and they weren't just selling Games Workshop stuff. They were selling other games, other things. So another thing that kind of sort of looms large in my influential past of role-playing was a RuneQuest that wasn't Glorantha. I don't know if this was a uniquely British thing, but there was this very Romano-Celtic sort of version of RuneQuest that seemed to be around in Britain, and was always my impression of RuneQuest. So that was influential, and that's a period of history. It's pre-Christian Europe that's always fascinated me. Then we had like Robin of Sherwood on TV, and yeah, so a lot of lower, grittier, less wacky fantasy was my influence, and D&D certainly wasn't there. You know, I started with the fighting fantasy books when I was maybe 7 or 8. Graduated to role-playing when I was 8 or 9, getting a lot of things wrong, because even though I was advanced for my age in reading, absorbing even a light version of Rolemaster, which is what Middle-earth role-playing was at the time, bit of a challenge, but we still had fun. But I didn't even encounter D&D until I was about probably 13. Ended up sort of rolling at secondary school with a bunch of other weirdos, freaks and nerds, and one of them was heavily into his basic D&D. So that's where I encountered it. Didn't take to it very much, because in one of the adventures I snuck up on a sleeping dragon and, without being noticed, stabbed it in the eye, and all I got for my trouble was double damage, which struck me as absurd. So there you go. So D&D isn't that important to me in the same way that it is for a lot of other people. And my solution, generally, rather than house ruling D&D, is to play something else. Woofrup, or Dragon Warriors, or the Riddle of Steel, or whatever else it might be. But as a designer more than a player or a games master, the temptation is always there to fiddle with D&D, because D&D is the titan of the role-playing landscape. It looms over everything. It changes everything. And if you can hitch your wagon to D&D, there's a certain kind of player, a certain kind of gaming group that are willing to let you distort D&D virtually out of all recognition and still play it, because it's still D&D, and to them role-playing is D&D, D&D is role-playing, and that's just how it is. So sometimes, if you want to get those kind of playing experiences, if you want to get that kind of design attention, maybe you compromise and you house rule D&D. And when I house rule D&D, it's usually to get closer to that kind of lower magic, grittier fantasy that I tend to prefer. Not always, but I tend to prefer it. Now, I did do a series of articles called Grimdark last year. You can find them on my Patreon. They are behind a paywall, I'm afraid. So you'll have to cough up at least $1 for a month to read them. They're back about June of last year. They will eventually be a book. So detailing how I would change D&D to create a much grittier, darker, grimdark setting. And that's generally where I would go with most house rules. Not all. But the person who requested the video didn't specify which edition, so I'm gonna have to keep this fairly general, but let's get into it. The thing about D&D is that it has a lot of editions, and it has a lot of people's house rules and so on. The open gaming revolution was great in a lot of ways. It's allowed the old school thing to rise up. It's allowed whole kind of forks of D&D, at least in the form of Pathfinder, to spring up. It was bad too. There was too much stuff, and a lot of it wasn't particularly high quality during the 3rd edition D&D days. It's great if you managed to ride the coattails and make a bit of money and invested it wisely, but for the industry as a whole, I think that the boom and bust was probably the worst one since Magic came onto the scene. Unfortunately, put a lot of shops under. There was a lot of unused stock out there. But it has left a legacy of a whole bunch of stuff that you can thieve from, and if you don't feel like thieving from third-party sources, you can always thieve from the various historical editions of D&D. Weirdly, 4th edition is actually a big one. For all that it's one of the most hated versions of D&D out there, and for all it was quickly kind of shuffled aside and largely forgotten about, there are elements to it and solutions that people came up with to deal with the problems with 4th edition that are pretty good. One thing I would take from it is the idea of the extended skill challenge. There was a competition to write an adventure for 4th edition for I think Dragon Magazine was still going at the time, but eventually they ended up publishing it on the website, and my adventure that I wrote was basically one very long skill challenge called Cross City Race. I think you can still find it online. I think it's a fun little adventure, and it's a non-combat adventure, so I was trying to kind of challenge myself and do something different and showcase one of the few things that I thought was really good with 4th edition. But that idea of the extended skill challenge, that can be pretty easily ripped out of 4th ed and plonked in wherever you go. One of the big problems that I had with 4th edition, and I think one of the big problems that a lot of people had with 4th edition, was its complete reliance on the battle mat and miniatures and so on. So much of it was to do with positioning and movement and that kind of tactical side of things, probably because they were trying to push the miniatures market even more. But for old school people like me who tended to roleplay theatre of the mind, this was not helpful at all, and it also makes it a lot more difficult to spontaneously play games on the fly, right? If you've got to lug around maps and minis and everything, it's just extra hassle. But we did successfully run a whole Dark Sun campaign based on 4th edition. And the way I got around it was I created the idea of the tactical pool. So any of those powers or abilities that allowed you to do an extra slide, or to shift to flanking, or to control the position of the enemy, instead of actually doing that, because we weren't using a battle map, it poured points into a thing called a tactical pool, which basically represented your flowing physical, positional, morale, not moral, advantage. So that gave you a pool of points that you could then take from and spend to add to your roll to hit or to do damage or whatever else, because you had that tactical advantage. And I think that's something that's often missing, not just in D&D but in a lot of role-playing games, is the advantage of tactics and pre-planning and so on. It's sometimes there in the abstract. You might get a surprise turn, or you're already in cover as the combat starts. But this created a real tactical feeling without the need for the board, and it allowed the less combat-oriented characters to feel like they could contribute in combat in a way perhaps that they couldn't necessarily under normal circumstances. Less of a problem in 4th E as written, but we were house ruling other stuff because not everyone wanted to play a combat monkey, and by default everyone in 4th Ed is pretty much a combat monkey. So yeah, there were checks and balances going on there. But this idea of creating a pool of points, whether from a tactical skill, from whatever plan they happen to come up with, from special abilities during combat, is a good way of bringing that tactical element into Theatre of the Mind. So that was my solution. It worked pretty well once I learned that I should probably limit how many points they should be allowed to spend, so I didn't allow more than doubling anything after a while. So that worked quite well, and that's an idea that I've taken into a lot of my own game design moving forward. Another thing that was really good from 4th Ed that I think was worth stealing was the idea of bloodied. A lot of games have this death spiral, so as you get more wounded you get less effective at doing whatever it is that you're doing. White Wolf had that quite a bit with dice penalties and so on. It's a key feature in actual fucking monsters. A lot of games have that. D&D never really did. You were fine, then you were unconscious, then you were dead. That was it. Basically. And 4th Ed brought in the idea of bloodied, so when you're at half hit points, then you start taking a penalty, but it was counterbalanced somewhat by some creatures, some characters, some abilities, some feats, whatever, were triggered while you were bloodied. But as a not too intrusive way of bringing in that sense that a character is injured and at bay, just taking that half hit points level and imposing some sort of penalty on them for being below that does work really well. It's not too complicated, but it brings that element in. Of course, you could always expand it out if you wanted to and create more levels of harm, more levels of penalty, however you wanted to go about it. Another thing from 4th Ed, I know, it's weird, right? There's a lot you can steal from it, but was the idea of mooks. So disposable baddies that were reduced XP, reduced hit points, but were otherwise the same as others. One thing you can really have a problem with in D&D, especially at higher levels, is combat drags. And it has the overall impression of two Ents taking turns to hit each other with a hatchet. Thok, your turn. Thok, your turn. Thok, your turn. Thok, and so on, and it just turns into a grind. If you reduce the hit points of certain enemies, foot soldiers or whatever, then you can get those more kind of dramatic, energized scenes from heroic films or whatever, where, you know, Legolas is like and 3 orcs are gone, or whatever else it might be. So doing that in any version of D&D really speeds up combat, can really help give the players the sense that their characters are powerful and competent, and that can also free you up to spend more points on the boss battle, or whatever you want to call it. So mooks are something that I would bring into any version of D&D that I ran, even a grimdark one. Even though it can make it easier for the players, they can also get swamped by a lot of low-level baddies. So that's something. So we're now into the more into the weeds, into the thickets, into the things that are more me. I suppose. So one of the big things I don't like about 5th edition, and I didn't like about 4th edition, was the way that they re-dumbed down skills into being more like proficiencies. I much preferred the 3rd edition way of doing things. I much prefer skill-based systems to level-based progression systems. I mean, the 3rd edition skill system was a bit of a botch, bit of a wangle, but it did still work, and I miss that. So this is kind of pilfering from other editions, but it does take a bit more work than just lifting and inserting, so to speak. And that's what she said. But the point is, that I prefer skill customization more. So let's take the example in 5th edition of the Rogue. Okay, at starting level you get to pick 4 skills, but all that means is that you get your proficiency bonus when you're using those skills, which is +2. So I haven't put a huge deal of thought into this for this video, but you might say that, okay, so that means at level 1 you get 8 skills, 8 skill points, and you can distribute that freely amongst any of the rogue skills that you like, and that gives you that +1. Alright, you don't get your proficiency bonus on your skills, you get your training bonus on your skills, which is based on those points. So what's to stop you putting all 8 in acrobatics or whatever? I would say limit it to a maximum bonus of double the proficiency bonus of your level, up to maybe a maximum of 10. The normal proficiency bonus at level 20 I think is +6. So if we limit that to 10 instead of 12, it's just a nice round easy number for people to remember, and that works fine. So you could put 4 points into acrobatics or whatever else, and you'd still have another 4 points. You could put +1 in 4 other things. So that lets you play more of a generalist or more of a specialist. Just gives you that extra degree of character customization that's important to me. So that's kind of new, because you really have to adapt it a lot to whatever edition comes along, but it's kind of lifting from 3rd. I wasn't sure which section to put it in, so it's here. Another big bugbear with D&D for me is how long fights take. And, that used to be combined with the fragility of basic starting characters, which they've addressed by creating boosts to hit points for starting characters. But then that just adds to the hit point bloat problem later on, I find. So I would pretty much do away with the existing sort of class hit points thing, and I would say maybe go with Constitution score is hit points with your strength bonus added on, and then for scholarly classes, so like your mage and your sorcerer or whatever, you get 1 additional hit point per level. For your hybrid classes, so like a rogue, cleric, that sort of thing, who are neither entirely brainiacs nor entirely muscle, you might get another 2 hit points per level. And then for your fighting classes, you would get 3 hit points per level. That means you get a decent chunk of hit points to start with, but it doesn't get a lot bigger over time, and that is the major thing that really slows down combat in D&D. That will also encourage a more grimdark approach, so, being tactical, referring back to the tactical skills, trying to ensure that you have surprise or ambush. It ramps up the stakes, it makes combat a lot quicker by making it more deadly, particularly if you combine it with the mooks rules and so on. Of course, monsters need to be addressed in the same way, and I would tend to approach that by using their scores again. Use 11 as the average if they don't have a stat, which they don't in some editions, and then also taking into account their size. So maybe a static penalty or increase, or divide the hit points according to size. Small and medium creatures should probably keep their full hit points, because there are certain small playable classes, but for anything smaller or bigger, you should probably give a chunk of hit points in there. That seems the way to go for me, because then monsters die more easily, more quickly, players die more easily, more quickly, higher stakes, but you're also not completely weak and feeble and useless. At first level, you got a decent chunk of hit points. And of course the magic becomes much higher priority there. But if you want to tweak with the magic and go for a more low magic setting, then if you make the magic weaker, it's not so much really of a big deal. Commensurate to that, I have never liked armor class as you don't get hit. There's a number of ways you can deal with that. One way I did once was to break down your armor class. So if the enemy only scores this much, you dodge. If they only score this much, it hits your armor. If they only score this much, it hits your shield. You know, what you parry with your shield, whatever else. That dealt with it in a descriptive manner by removing some of the abstraction, but I still found it unsatisfying. There are optional versions of rules in earlier editions where armor soaks damage as well as adding to your AC, and that kind of hybrid is about where I'd want to be. I don't think there is a perfect solution for D&D. If you get rid of armor as AC entirely, people get hit too much, and if you put it entirely to damage reduction, then a lot of things can't really hurt anyone. So you need a kind of hybrid there. You'd have to find your own level that you're satisfied with, but there's versions of that and optional rules for that in older editions. Mental stuff isn't something that's really dealt with particularly well in D&D, and it's something I have put a lot of thought into. And what I would do is I would import something from my own game, so this counts as my house rules, I guess, Machinations of the Space Princess, where you have a kind of mental hit points as well. So things that terrify or scare or otherwise remove your character's agency in some way by causing madness or whatever else. Those erode your mental health points, and you get those back by carousing or therapy or, you know, just slowly over time as well. But if they get reduced all the way down, you don't die, but you go mad. And the other thing that I tend to prefer to do with madness in games is not to remove the agency of the player entirely. You know, so like say, you have to run away for the next 10 turns or whatever. But tell the player, okay, you are now utterly terrified of this thing. How do you want to approach it? And random madnesses and so on never really made much sense to me. You know, if you go mad fighting hell spiders or something, then arachnophobia is probably the madness that you should develop. So yeah, instead of dying, you would develop a permanent mental health issue based around whatever it was that took you over that edge. More of a sort of Call of Cthulhu approach, I guess. Mind you, Call of Cthulhu could use, even in the current edition, could use a little bit of modernisation in its approach to mental health and madness. Similar to that, I like to... like is a strong word. I like to give people permanent injuries when they end up really hurt. So when they're down to the point where they're taking death saves, then you should probably give them a nice scar or reduce one of their stats or lop their hand off or something. There's various tables out there for permanent wounds. You can even lift them from entirely different games. Warhammer's got some good ones. My game Blood, he said, plug, has some good critical hit tables that you could use, and I did do a fantasy version of Blood once, which was bloody but memorable. So that can create a sense of stakes. It can also create a sense of history to the campaign, you know? See this scar? Got that fighting a kobold. Or, yeah, you want to go in the dungeons, do you? Well, check out my double wooden legs. You don't want to be going down there. And so on. Another thing for speeding up combat, critical hits have always been a bit wussy and unspectacular. I think it might be better if they were rarer but more effective. So, well, we'll get to the rarer in a sec. But what if, instead of a crit with a dagger doing 2d4, it did d4 times d4? Or d4 plus your strength bonus times d4. So that way, your average spot is going to have maybe 10 or 11 hit points, and that means a single critical hit with a dagger can take out a peasant if you're lucky, and that seems about right. Yeah, intuitively that seems about right. Of course, the other option is to just make them a mook, but critical hits, I think, should be rarer but more effective. At least that's what satisfies me more. This takes us to the last really big house rule. I know other people have done this. When you're approaching game design, well, fairly standard game designs, there's two paths that you can take when it comes to task resolution and so on. If you use a single dice and bonuses and penalties and so on, you tend to get a very wild, flat sort of probability line. So you're going to botch 5% of the time in D&D, and you're going to crit 5% of the time in D&D. Again, this depends which rules, which situation you're in, and so on. And your ability to do anything is wildly variable. Now, this is great for some things. It can create a really unpredictable, random thing with moments of brilliance and moments of stupidity, but it's much less grounded. And if you want a grittier, darker, slightly more predictable game, you don't want that flat line. You want a probability curve where things tend to peak in the middle, where it's the normal, the average sort of thing tends to be what happens. Fate's pretty good for that, which is weird because it has this reputation as this kind of heroic, wild, out there game, but the mechanic really favours the average. Little bit odd. But if you want to bring that kind of grittiness into D&D and make botches and crits in the same way much less likely, replace the D20 with 2D10. Double 1 is a botch, double 0 is a crit. And that will do a hell of a lot to making the game feel more gritty and realistic. Realistic up to a point, obviously. Now that would be my top few tips for D&D House Rules that you may or may not enjoy. I will at some point get around to doing my Grimdark guide. So if you want to know my more specific thoughts on any of this, you will be able to get that at some point in the future. If you want to read the old articles, they're on Patreon, $1 a month, and you'll get alerts to my videos, you'll get alerts to all my blog posts and writings and articles wherever I happen to be doing anything. You'll get to suggest videos and so on. And increasingly, if I get enough subs, either there or on Subscribestar, I'll be starting to do some exclusive content. So yeah, give me your money. I've been told I should pimp myself more, so there, come get some. Zang.
Get you anything you want. You just have to talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. Talk to me. I'm your priest. I'm your shrink. I'm your main connection to the switchboard of souls. I'm the magic man. The Santa Claus of the subconscious. You say it. You even think it. You can't have it.